Welcome, everyone. Today we are talking with Terra McDaniel about children and dealing with grief and loss and death kinds of topics. And Terra is a spiritual director, teacher, and writer who loves making space for people of all ages to tune into the holy and their own souls. She received an MDiv with a concentration in spiritual formation from Portland Seminary. She and her husband live in Austin, Texas with their rescue dogs. And she's thankful. This is so great. Her daughter, son-in-law, and granddogs are only 10 minutes away. And you can find her at terramcdaniel.com. And she will share her email and web at the end so that you all can connect with her later if you need to do that. And with that, Terra, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Gosh, I'm so glad to be with all of you this morning, and I'm just really, I'm really mindful of the work that you have all been doing the past several years, the work you've been doing more generally with children, but particularly in this last season of pandemic and other tensions. I'm mindful of the heavy lifting that hosting children has been, and hope that our conversation can be an encouragement, can offer some perspective and tools that will serve you well in that good and holy work that you're doing. I kind of wanted to start with things that we're kind of holding together culturally. My guess is that you've seen headlines like "No Way to Grow Up," which is the New York Times story that came out in January of this year that just traced all these different ways that children are really have been harmed, experienced difficulty, experienced loss of various kinds through the pandemic and otherwise. Headlines like 8-year-olds in despair, things like 3 of the respected holistic and mental health agencies in the United States joining together for a statement saying, hey, we have a mental health crisis among our children and teens. That's something that happened last year that I imagine many of you are aware of. So these things are kind of the air that we're breathing. It's the experience of the children more broadly, and certainly there's no question that it's something that you're seeing show up in your communities. I read an article from the Washington Post that came out sometime late last month that was kind of reviewing some of these things, and excuse me, an upcoming president of the American Pediatrics said that actually, said it's not a mistake to say that there is sort of a mental health crisis, that suicides among children and teens are on the rise. All of those things are happening, but she said actually this has been building for years and even decades, and it's sort of been hiding in plain sight. And what the pandemic has done is sort of shine a fresh light on it. All to say, these conversations matter, and the ways that we are able to help the children among us bring their grief into the light, tell stories about it, help them make meaning of it. It matters deeply. I'll share my screen in just a moment, and we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of what I hope to share and talk about. But before I do, I'm going to read from Mark, from the gospel passage that serendipitously, providentially was the gospel passage for this morning, and just to sort of ground our conversation. And it's this: people were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant. And he said to them, let the little children come to me. Do not stop them. So notice the disciples are like, these children are in the way. Make them be quiet. Let them get on the margins again. And Jesus is like, oh no, The other thing to notice, the children were already coming to him. Like they didn't have to be coached. And so, for us as hosts with children, for you as ministers of the gospel with children, you get to join them in coming toward Jesus. Thankfully, your role is not to inspire them to do so. You just get to participate in something that's already happening in their souls. So let the children come to me, do not stop them, for it is such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly, I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. He took them up, laid his hands on them, blessed them, right? And so, so that beautiful image of the kind of welcome that Jesus had, and the ways that while we absolutely are invited to host and teach and shepherd children, they are our teachers just as much, right? Because they're models of what receiving the kingdom of God looks like, right? So with all of that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through some things that I hope will be beneficial. To preserve time for question and answer toward the end, there may be a few slides that I don't spend much time with or skip altogether. Know that this presentation will be available to you after, so you can return to it. Anything that you wanted to spend more time with, perhaps. So with that, let me see if I can, through the magic of technology, share my screen. Let's see here. Great. And if that little thing, yes, good. Okay. So can everybody see? You're good? Okay, wonderful. So let's talk together about what it is to help children grieve. And again, our starting point, I think, has to be that Western cultures, particularly in the US, tend to be death denying, grief avoiding, and yet, these past several years have made that much more complicated. And so this is where we are. And children are often described as the forgotten mourners. Because grief shows up differently for them, they can be presumed to be feeling it less intently, experiencing it less fully. And they can be forgotten in the process. And our invitation is to remember them, is to host them well. Tobin Hart, a child psychologist, who has studied children's spiritual experiences extensively. He writes, a child's serious questions about life and meaning may be dismissed with responses like, "You're not old enough to understand." Have you ever heard someone say that to a child? Have you ever been guilty of saying it to a child? I have. And so what is it to have a different posture, right? Let me see here. So what is grief like for children? I'm going to move your lovely faces so I can see. There we go. So what is grief like for children? It often gets expressed or shows up more as anxiety than grief as we might recognize it or express it as grown-ups. Children may feel like they don't fit in. If they've experienced loss of various kinds, they may feel with their peers that they're different, that their friends won't understand them anymore. They may feel guilty or responsible for what has happened. I listened to a teaching, which again, I'll recommend as part of the resources for some grief counselors located here in Austin, actually. And they told the story of a young boy whose father tragically died in a car accident on his way to work. This boy was around 5 years old. And the night before, the father and son had this ritual where before he dropped off to sleep, the dad would come in and tuck him in and give him a kiss goodnight, tell him goodnight. But on the night before his dad's car accident, he fell asleep before his dad came to tuck him in. And when he learned his father died, he was utterly convinced that his dad was so sad that he had fallen asleep, that he hadn't been able to tell him goodnight, that this distracted him on his drive to work, and that's why the car accident happened. So children may feel responsible. And so working with them, communicating with them, making space for their questions becomes really important. Another thing about children in this larger context, because we tend to deny grief, because there can be a cultural tendency to suppress the questions of children. They may put their grief on the back burner when adults are actively grieving. And so it may be that months or even years later, when the adults in their lives, their caregivers, have kind of found a new normal. I've got a wandering earbud. Let me help it find its way there. As the adults in their lives begin to become settled, there may be this outburst of anger, grief, anxiety that surprises adults until they kind of step back and realize, oh, what's changed? Well, what's changed is I've gotten to a place where I actually have more capacity to connect with this child's grief. What about for particularly young children? So kids, say 11 and younger. Grief is often carried in the body. So it can show up in belly aches. It can show up in headaches and things like this. So just awareness that it may have some surprising manifestation. This is, of course, true for adults as well. However, with younger children, they have a limited feelings vocabulary, and so they may struggle in that and other ways to express it, and so it may get lodged in the physical body. Younger children, particularly, really don't understand the permanence of death yet, or other kinds of losses, and so staying with them in that understanding, gently walking with them into more clarity is really important. And with the youngest children, when there's grief, when there's loss, when there's mourning happening, physical affection becomes really important. Again, that embodied holistic experience. They haven't broken up their emotions and their physical body and their thoughts yet. This precious image, this sweet girl, you'll notice her shirt says happy, and yet that is not even close to the experience that she's having when this photograph was taken. Children tend to grieve in small windows, and they move in and out of grief and mourning and joy and play. This does not mean that the loss doesn't matter to them, right? It means that their capacity for bigger emotions is more limited than we have as adults. And so to honor the developmental place that they're in becomes really important. Children need permission to say, I can't talk about this right now. And that needs to be okay. And again, doesn't mean that the loss is not significant. It means that capacity is different. And that's where they are. It's important for children to see grief modeled in significant adults. So of course, that's their immediate caregivers. For you as ministers, what are age-appropriate ways that you can talk about your own grief without overwhelming the children, right? But to help them see that there's permission to talk about these things. It's not taboo. And to see how you model engaging your sadness and engaging the complexity of grief and lament with them. And yet understanding that children may feel overwhelmed and uncomfortable with adult tears. So making spaces for those to happen appropriately. How about for teens? it can be kind of difficult to disentangle what's developmental and where grief and loss is showing up. And so for teens, it becomes particularly important to watch for behavioral changes. Privacy for teens, very important. So resisting kind of invading, and yet, and here's that complexity, that dance of helping them not feel alone. And so are there ways of offering peer support, inviting them to journal, inviting them to tell stories. In my case, offering spiritual direction with children can be a really safe place for children to engage their grief. And can I just say, so we know it will not be a surprise that children are grieving so much in this season, and the complexity and layers of grief are pretty profound. So it's certainly the bigger things, like I've been surfacing, of losing a family member, living through a pandemic, but it's also smaller losses like social connection, and more kind of systemic ones like not getting to spend time with friends and things like that, and worries about how long will this last? When will we be back? Those kinds of things. So honoring and creating hospitality and spaciousness for the stories to be told. And I wonder how you can do that in your contexts. I'll address, this may be less relevant for your concerns, but I'll address briefly families kind of mourning together. Again, it's vital for adults to do their own grief work. And grief, I love this image I heard in a teaching about children and grief, and families and grief, that it's kind of like a merry-go-round in that each are moving at their own pace. They have their own particular ways of engaging grief. So to have permission for, and even welcome of, we're going to be in different places, and sometimes somebody's going to be in a lower point where others may feel a little more stable, the expressions of grief being different, all of those things. So just making space to honor that, it becomes really important. When you're hosting children in grief, these three become really important, starting with listening. Then telling the truth. So thinking about the young boy I mentioned a moment ago, who was convinced that it was his fault, his dad died. Telling them the truth, you didn't cause this accident. Telling them the truth, you can't catch cancer. Telling them the truth, here's what we know about the pandemic. Here's what we don't. Here's what we know about gun violence. Here's what we know about how to stay safe. Telling them the truth, engaging the questions that they actually have. And then as much as you can manage, creating structure and stability, because that creates safety for children when they are feeling kind of tossed about. And so, this is something that you have an opportunity to provide as you have your rhythms of worship, as you have your structure of teaching and gatherings that are weekly or however they happen for all of you. So the structure and stability, knowing what they can count on and what they can't. Let's see, let me pause here before I keep moving on. Are there any questions? And again, there's going to be more time but let me just pause and say, at this point, are there any questions that would be helpful to ask?
I have a question. Is it something we should approach before it happens, like in teaching a lesson, or is it something that we should approach when it happens, one-off, as we know grief is happening in our families?
Yeah. I would say yes, right? Like as much as you're able to to address these things before before you're in the thick of a child that's mourning. So that's talking about grief and loss. That's talking about the welcome of a range of emotions, and addressing more specifically when there's a loss. I think I would say that as much as you're able to incorporate both, I think that serves children really well. Yeah. Does that help? Let's see. So I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Let's get to some sort of practical ways that you might help children process grief and loss. Creating opportunities for children to safely ask their why questions is vital. And here is where you can cultivate a non-anxious presence for maybe even some questions about, hey, what about God? Is God good? Why didn't God stop this? And to be a safe place to ask those why questions is an invaluable gift for children. At the same time, you have this opportunity to help them kind of make meaning over time, not speeding past the why questions, but helping them kind of make meaning of what is this loss, and what does it mean about themselves? What does it mean about their families, communities? What does it mean about who God is to them? All of those things. So some things that you can invite children to engage. Drawing fiercely can be a fantastic way of kind of discharging anxiety and anger and grief. When kids are processing a particular loss, you can invite them to create a photo album. So, this is something you could invite kids to bring some resources and create that together. You can invite them to tell stories about the loss or about the loved one, and you can do this among the children. Let them hear from one another as you're hosting and providing safety and guidance. Welcoming tears is vital. You can invite them to draw a family tree. And I love the language of draw who lives with you, because what that often does is it'll invite children to draw as well the pets that live with them that can be wonderful sources of resilience and comfort, as well as significant sources of loss when they pass away. And so welcoming those other precious creatures into the conversation can be important. Creating a worry tree, and a worry tree is sort of taking butcher paper and drawing the outline of a tree, and you can use Post-its, or you can cut out leaves if you're feeling you have time for that lovely task, and let children write down their worries and their questions. Things like, is someone else going to get sick? Is someone else going to die? Whatever the subject that you're mourning, or if you're simply making room for the depth and breadth, making room for those worries to be brought into the light becomes really important. You can invite children to write a letter to God, or to tear paper or cloth, in kind of a visceral expression of grief and loss. And then I'll share. Let me talk briefly about an activity that I've been guiding children and frankly adults through over the past several years since the advent of the pandemic. And it's almost kind of an examine project, but it begins with letting children tell the story of grief through tearing. And this can be a really powerful experience, again, for children and adults, but we're talking about children here. And so invite them to tune into what they're grieving and to tell the story of it with their hands, tearing as much as little or as little as they want. They get to decide. Are there huge chunks? Are they tearing the paper into tiny bits of confetti? And it's a holistic sensory experience. They get a chance to listen to the sound. They can feel the torn edges, and in that process, they can let their mad or sad or anxious or confused feelings talk to them. And you can even invite them to invite God kind of into that conversation. And so at that point, I'll invite the group to kind of come back together and process together. What was that like? What did you notice as you were tearing? Let them hear themselves, notice their experience, and learn from each other. And then I invite us to shift to a collage making activity. And so I invite them to take some of their torn bits of paper and maybe some photographs, some paints or markers or colored pencils, whatever you have available, and then create something around what silver linings have they noticed in the midst of grief. What hopes do they have for what will come in the future? What dreams do they have? And again, allowing this to be an embodied, enacted prayer. Inviting their own hopes and God in the midst of it, right? And so, and this does a couple of things. It underscores the extent to which the full range of our emotions are welcome in God's presence and welcome in your presence, by the way, as you're hosting these. And implicit is this idea that sadness and brokenness and loss can be transformed and incorporated into life going forward. It can be transformed. It can be redeemed, right? And that's an idea that I would say you probably don't even need to articulate as such. Because the children will be experiencing it, and that's enough. Children. We talked before we began recording. We talked about the beautiful importance of children's books and the ways that they can help us find ways into stories of grief and loss. And I love questions like these when you're engaging these kinds of books. Asking children, who are you in this story? Why is that? And do you have a favorite page? What's special about that page? Those kinds of things. Here are a few of my favorite books about sadness and suffering and loss. Again, you'll have this available to you, and there are all sorts of loss that is addressed here. All sorts of sadness. Here are some others. So those are a few favorites, and I'll hold up a few in just a moment when I stop sharing my screen. And then let's see. Yeah. So this is my email. Here's my website. If you have further questions or curiosity, don't hesitate to reach out. And again, this will be available to you. And I'll tell you as well, I am working on a book around the subject of Holy Lament for InterVarsity Press. And that manuscript gets turned in early this summer. And so I'd love to, keep you in the loop. So sign up and ask to be, kept in the loop about when that is coming out, if that is something of interest to you. So with all of that, let me stop now sharing my screen, and we get to have our lovely faces all back together. I'll say two more things. I'll hold up a couple of books, and then I want to open it up for questions and conversation. So two other books that weren't on the presentation that are kind of ways in to grief and loss. It's a book on centering prayer for children that can be really helpful. Praying in Color, which may be familiar to many of you. It's a wonderful, simple, but powerful. And then, can I just say, classics of stories that help children understand the realities of loss and life on the other side of it. So Charlotte's Web, of course, one example among many.